Good morning, everyone. My name is Fadzai Mashiri, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all for joining us for our third session of the Prescribed Fire webinar series. Today's webinar session is focused on prescribed fire planning, and we have two great speakers with extensive knowledge and experience that are ready to share their knowledge with us. Just to go through the usual logistics, all the attendees are going to be muted throughout the webinar. And if you have any technical issues or you want to communicate with the panelists or also want to share something with all the attendees, please leave your comment in the chat box. It's the button with one speech bubble at the bottom of the Zoom page. And then if you have any questions for speakers, please submit those in the Q&A box. It's a button, you click on the button with two speech bubbles at the bottom of the page as well. Right now we have polls that are going on that are on your screen. If you can please fill those out for us, we'll really appreciate that. And then we'll end those and move on to our first presentation. And I also have an announcement. If you are a certified professional rangeland management person and you need CEUs, we are working with SRM to allow us for you to use time that you're spending on here towards your CEU. So if you are CPRM, please contact me and then I'll send you a form to fill out for your CEUs. So it seems like we are getting close to having almost everyone submit their responses to the poll. And don't forget to click submit when you're done so we can actually get to see your input. Thank you. I guess while we wait for a few people to submit their responses, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Steve Engfer. He is a senior planner with Mariposa County Planning Department, and he's going to give a presentation on wildland-urban interface and community planning from his experience working with CEPAL. Welcome, Steve, and I think we'll close the poll, Max. And Steve, please go ahead and share your presentation.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let's see. Let me get to the view here. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me here today. Good morning, all. I hope all are well, given the circumstances we're all facing worldwide with the COVID-19. Steve from Mariposa Planning here, as Fadzai had mentioned, and I'm going to go ahead and get right into the presentation, which is intended to provide a snapshot of the WUI and planning dynamics with some details of the local situation and planning activities here in Mariposa. I'll be referencing some recent and very relevant community planning assistance for wildfire grant program recommendations for Mariposa that include some information and graphics in this presentation, and that's commonly referred to here as CPA, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire. We know this is a big topic, and seeing as it's such a big subject, I'll cover what I can today. And please feel free to reach out to me anytime for additional information in the future. Having said that, I'll roll right into this. I've reviewed a little bit about some of what people have defined as the WUI And the wildland-urban interface, according to the U.S. Fire Administration, is an area where human-made structures and infrastructure of any type are adjacent to areas prone to wildfire. It's a broad definition, and it kind of encapsulates pretty much any built environment in areas prone to wildfire. So whether you're in Australia, South America, Europe, America, and certainly here in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, we definitely have development in WUI. And the WUI is a kind of continuum where you have this range of landscapes with the development of human development and activities in relation to the ecosystem that exists there. So WUI is functionally a definition of the human interaction with that environment in that wildfire-prone ecosystem. So this slide from the CPAW presentation recently here in Mariposa provides a basic overview of what many of us are dealing with worldwide, whether we're here in California, in the eastern US and the boreal forest areas, or even in some of the tropics and other parts of the world, where there are increased populations migrating into these environments. It increases the WUI in terms of people and structures in those environments, from the wildlands or rural environments like we have in Mariposa, with some level of densities and what might be even termed urban and very focused nodal community planning areas. So we all are probably familiar with the terrain here that are participating on what this is. So on to the next slide. Why is it important? Well, it's important to us because we deal with the losses associated with all of the built environments and our living environments within these ecosystems. And so we have life structures and economics impacted, and then of course the quality of life associated with a ecosystem and what some people might term as ecosystem services today. You know, there's a lot of losses. This one, you know, there's statistics all over. I just grabbed a few for this presentation. And really, this is a situation where you have the industry, the insurance industry, providing some information here on this slide about what some of the losses have been. There's no question that the WUI is a growing land use type. According to our favorite Wikipedia, we have in the United States alone, between 90 and 2010, the WUI has been the fastest growing land use type. Its primary cause was migration, not vegetation growth. And many of the situations are people are moving into legacy vegetation growth areas. And new WUI areas, 90%, 97% plus or minus were the result of new housing in those areas. So worldwide, we see this kind of shift as people want to move into areas where you have WUI growth, and including in areas such as Argentina, France, South Africa, Australia. You know, people are moving into areas where they want to have these scenic natural resources. Of course, that presents problems for us. So why is planning involved? Well, we have the existing and proposed development governance structure. In California, we have general plan requirements for land use and zoning regulations such as subdivisions, design, landscaping, things of that sort. Here locally, we have some plans where there's these plan relationships that are important to managing and regulating land uses and development within the WUI areas. This is the Countywide Conservation Wildfire Protection Plan, the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, the General Plan Safety Element, and there are some other documents as well. In planning in California, there's some mandated responsibility areas. And so for us, it's important because there's that crossroads between the development within these environments. And so that's why we think planning's involved. This slide is demonstrative of what happens around the country and, you know, in other parts of the world as well, where we have a depiction here of different types of development in relation to the WUI and some of the things that we deal with in the planning front for regulating the development within those environments. As a side note, this is not just for WUIs. Obviously, we're dealing with land use regulations for a variety of other reasons too. And so this is a good overview of some of the things to consider relative to how planning interfaces with wildfire. Again, thanks to the CPOP folks and our recent activities with them, we have some really great graphics that just demonstrate well for everybody here what the situation is. So moving into some specifics about Mariposa's circumstance, this slide presents to you some of the parcel-based information from our GIS system relative to the state fire severity zone maps. And so we have a local responsibility area and a state responsibility area identification of hazard zones for wildfire risk in Mariposa County. The outline is Mariposa County. And the yellow areas are moderate areas, and the reddish kind of tones are the very high hazard designated areas, and then the orange are high designated areas. Generally speaking, it's all of the parcels in the county are affected in some way. On the western flank, which would be the yellow areas, the broader areas towards what shows as Planada and La Grande on the map, that would be the western border of the county. And there's oak savanna rangelands there. There are some pockets, as you can see, with orange areas where there might be some riparian zones and additional vegetation that ratcheted up to the next level in terms of severity. And so as you move upslope, you can see that there are high and very high areas. So the broad areas to the east, there's a wide range of public lands. And the National Park, Yosemite is there. Bureau of Land Management has quite a bit of land. And then also we have the Forest Service with 2 national forests bridging into the county, the Sierra and Stanislaus National Forest. But generally, we have about 14,000 parcels. As you can see, that all of them are pretty much within one of these areas of severity. Mariposa County has undergone quite a range of wildfires. This couple slides depicts some of the fires that have occurred since around 2008. And so you can see that there's been quite a few fires. And this isn't all of the spot fires that have occurred, but it's the primary fires that people may associate with more of a catastrophic fire type event. Thankfully, we haven't had a significant number of human losses, although us locals here, may be very familiar with some losses recently with the Ferguson fire from firefighters that were involved with that. The reason why I'm showing you these slides is because it depicts the circumstances of where we are living and the frequency of fires that occur that are significant. So over the last few years, with the activity in California and also worldwide, obviously there's been a focused effort for folks to come up with ways to handle this WUI living environment and how to better address the legacy vegetation issues, as well as bringing in new regulatory and planning tools that will help facilitate more safe environments for the human environments and built environments in the communities. So we applied for a grant with the CPOC, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, excuse me, and we participated in that grant program last year. It's a year-long process. It evaluated some of the existing conditions and assessments of some of the plans that I described earlier in the presentation and regulatory frameworks to identify from new eyes maybe some things that we could prioritize for kind of a low-hanging fruit approach on changes that could really help accelerate some of the safety issues and address some of the safety issues with the WUI and Mariposa. And so some recommendations for implementation are were made by the report, and we've been implementing some of those since. It was a multi-stakeholder, multifaceted approach, which I think we all know if we're practicing in the WUI in land use planning or fire or landscape management, what we need to do is get multiple agencies, folks, and community members involved. And that certainly was something that CPAW addressed. They looked at the WUI and the wildfire risks. They evaluated our existing countywide fire plan, the CCWPP, and recommended some elevation of that plan, and also some recommendations on adopting some more streamlined approaches and synthesizing some of the regulatory environment into a more cohesive, focused document that could be easier for both developers and the public to work with. So as a part of that, the next steps that were currently underway from the CPAW recommendations, we have some linking going on with our wildfire plan update, which is underway presently. And there was a focus to vertically integrate that document to bring into that document, for example, the Mariposa Madera Strategic Fire Plan as an appendices, which is updated every year by CAL FIRE, and that has some overarching goals for vegetation management and clearing throughout the county and nearby. And so that's an important document to incorporate, as well as some mitigation referencing and recently adopted CPAW recommendations in the local hazard mitigation plan. And so vertically integrating those will help us to focus the efforts into this update that we're currently underway with the Fire Safe Council. We're also looking at additional zoning and development ordinances associated with that. And another recommendation was to obviously engage the community in a way where the community members take responsibility, which many people do. It's just some additional things to look for, kind of Firewise type communities. So in our efforts here locally in Mariposa planning, we have a multifaceted approach. And this is focused from involving multi-stakeholder engagement. And one of the primary issues for us is legacy vegetation and the development within it. This speaks directly to the webinar today in terms of various methods of managing that vegetation, both for the legacy issues and also for ongoing management and maintenance. There's an overgrowth. The development wasn't designed to withstand fires, so the structures aren't hardened. Many of the structures were developed, 70s, 80s, 60s, some of them. And so that combination of, for various reasons, the legacy vegetation, overgrowth, and that non-hardened structure ignition zone clearance situation equals a high risk. And the circumstances are such that our policy plans and regulatory tools need to address that in a way that incorporates education, outreach, and incentives. We believe that it's an incentive and it's kind of the carrot and the stick method. You have to have a little bit of both in order to reach the end goal. And then, of course, the county's interested in a multi-stakeholder engagement because it takes all of us living here to participate in this to make it functionally work. So the County Board of Supervisors convened the Mariposa County Fire Advisory Committee, which is a group that is focused primarily on the countywide plan update, and fire prevention, planning, and education in the county. And that group actually involves various stakeholders, and we're adding to that group over this first year of that group moving forward. The Forest Service, the Park Service, educational institutions, the Resource Conservation District, the Fire Safe Council, planning, they're all participants in that particular group. And that bodes well for making recommendations where there's a representation of this kind of the strata of the social dimension here in Mariposa. Additionally, we have the board advisory committees and planning advisory committees. We have an agricultural advisory committee, historic sites and preservation commission. We have multiple planning advisory committees throughout the county that all provide recommendations to the board. And then, of course, community organizations and partnerships. There's private groups, there's insurance groups, there's economic development folks that are interested in this kind of engagement and how to manage the development within the WUI. So there are definitely some planning efforts moving along. And I think this context plays out in the environments, whether it's in California or other nations, actually, in states like in South America. Take a particular jurisdiction, maybe some in Argentina, for example, they're grappling with how to deal with some of these things too. So in our efforts, the vegetation management is a key component. And prescribed fire and vegetation management tools for legacy vegetation reduction and ongoing maintenance is a really important part of managing the existing vegetation, both for addressing the legacy overgrowth and or the built environments within the ecosystem, and then also to maintain it over time. Grazing is another vegetation management tool that works well here. We have a wide area on the western flank of Mariposa. Roughly half of the private lands in the county are in ag land, range and forage production. And so there's a movement afoot, and there has been in the past as well, for rangeland managers and ranchers to graze for fire vegetation clearing. And then there's also, of course, hand and mechanical clearing and programs associated with that. In Mariposa, we have some issues associated with cleaning up after the drought and bark beetle kills of large stands of ponderosa pines and some other species throughout the community, and that's an ongoing activity. And then we also have some landscaping requirements in the Mariposa planning side of things. So vegetation management is key as a part of this whole approach as far as we can see. And our goals and objectives are to elevate that as a functional facet to the overall goal for WUI development planning. Some of the other planning efforts are associated with structure development specifically. We have the SIZs, or the structure ignition zones. You might see literature if you surf the web anywhere and then just Google that, you'll find that, or home ignition zones. And basically that's an envelope around the structure that would be cleared of vegetation that could cause a fire. Recent empirical information generated from some research on some of the California wildfires, and also some research that's been conducted nationwide in other areas. Folks like Steve Pine have done some good research that identify the importance of the structure ignition zone and ember flow associated with, burning embers falling on in a structure ignition zone area, maybe within 50 feet from a house where there's ignitable materials, and they catch fire and then they take out the structure. The structure at that point is fuel. So the structure ignition zones has been elevated significantly in our perspective to focus in some of our planning efforts and maybe some regulatory packages associated with that. And then, of course, structure hardening. That's, your fire resistant materials and the design of the structures. Site development standards such as landscaping regulations and site plan review for these things as part of the development process. Roadways, clearances around roadways, including additional distances, heights, and fuel load reductions. Shaded fuel breaks along the roadways are part of that effort. Water infrastructure supply, and then, of course, maintenance of that throughout the life of projects. So recently, Mariposa County has a planning environment where there's some activities for updating some plans and actually putting new plans on the books for some of the small communities throughout the county. And so we're looking at this fire safety overlay option as dealing with some that deals with some existing development standards that have applicability for land use planning in the WUI. There's building requirements by California code for WUI structural hardening currently on the books. There's California fire code. There's some land division requirements for road minimums and development standards. There's the clearances, the state requirements for vegetation management under Public Resources Code regulations, the 4290-91, that includes new driveways, new roadways, minimum dimensions, and for safe access and egress for fire conditions, and addressing access for firefighters, as well as vegetation management around structures. And so then there's also the California Environmental Quality Act, where there's obligations for mitigating risk for new development within these severity zones. That's an existing kind of a snapshot of the existing environment that addresses some of the fire-related planning activities in the regulatory and policy framework that we deal with. And we're looking at an area in Mariposa and Mid-Pines that basically incorporates a plan area as a part of the general plan. Communities never had a community plan in that area. And a big focus by the Citizen Advisory Group, the Planning Advisory Committee there, who make recommendations to the Planning Commission and the board for adoption of plans like this. Their big focus was their fire-adapted landscape they all live in and know very well. Some of the fires on the slides listed in earlier slides in the presentation were in and around this area. There's some legacy vegetation issues in the Mid-Pines area. Incidentally, it's along the Highway 140 corridor, about 7 to 10 miles from the town of Mariposa on the way to Yosemite National Park, the main entrance corridor, Highway 140. And so it's very important for this community to have fire policies and regulations put in place for fire to address the fire issues. So we're proposing a fire safety overlay that would take the existing regulatory framework and add some pieces to it that address some of the issues associated with the new development. So things like additional clearances around roads from the historical and existing requirements. That would include additional, like I mentioned, potentially shaded fuel breaks and things of that sort that go out further along subdivisions, shaded fuel breaks and fuel load management as a part of the subdivisions that get proposed in the area. Water supply that's relative to some numbers based on the California Fire Code, how much has to be in a given area for firefighters to have over and above what might be there today. Maintenance of existing road maintenance associations, new road maintenance associations, mechanisms put in place for continuing to manage that new clearance area around roadways, and then a compliance and inspection process and some additional absentee owner responsibilities. These are some of the things that we're looking at as potential tools to address new development within this WUI environment as it comes along. That being said, we're in the process of going through this plan update and providing this plan draft to the board in the future will tell us some of the views on how this will progress. One of the things that's important about this process is the county is looking at some of the recommendations from CPAW process, as well as what we know locally. And we're looking at how this might be something that would be applied over the whole of the county, and addressing some of the gaps identified through our assessment over this last year. So to conclude, the WUI is dynamic, and so is land use planning in the WUI. As mentioned in the slides earlier, this is something we're going to continue to see worldwide. People want to live in these environments, and it behooves us to make sure that we have opportunities in our land use planning efforts to address some of these issues as best we can. So I thank you for your time. I hope that you gained some information that was useful for you out of this presentation. And also thank the UCANR for the invitation. Please let us know if you have any questions or would like to reach out to us here at the emails listed below. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve, for that great presentation. It just shows that for us to actually attain fire safety for communities, we have to go beyond just understanding fire ecology and take a more multifaceted approach and trying to understand our socioeconomic situations in the different areas that we're working with. So we have a few questions in the Q&A section, in the Q&A, and we are going to hold those until the end. So we are going to move on to our next presenter, Rob York. He is a UCNR extension specialist in forestry, and he's based at UC Berkeley.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Rob York, and I am an extension specialist at UC Berkeley. So my job is to do research and extension work in California that is related to forest management. That's kind of the general sense of what I do. I've been interested in prescribed fire for a while now. Recently, I've been doing prescribed fire research, but I actually have more kind of experience with prescribed fire at the practitioner level and kind of the management level. And I started about 13 years ago trying to use fire, really trying to build up a program of using prescribed fire. So about 13 years ago, I was where I think a lot of landowners now in terms of like just getting into fire, trying to learn how to do it. And my perspective of fire is really from a do-it-yourself perspective and a self-education perspective for the most part. I got into it and I got experience by starting small and just by building up experience over time. And so I very much relate to you folks, you landowners who are interested in using fire, but you kind of face this some seemingly daunting prospect of learning about it and trying to actually, go through all the steps you need to go through to actually use it. So I also very much relate to you folks who are using fire for the objectives of reducing future wildfire severity, kind of like what Steve was talking about. So to me, using fire is a step that we can take to prevent the loss of forests, because we've seen wildfires actually convert forest land to shrublands. And I know some of you may have shrublands, and I'm not dissing shrublands or anything, but from my perspective, that's kind of one of the objectives I have, is to use fire to protect forests. And so that's kind of a little bit of my background in terms of the broader context. I just wanted to kind of go over that before sharing my screen here, which is what I will do now. Let's see. Okay, sorry. And this might take a few seconds to come online. If someone could confirm that they can see my screen, that would be great.
We can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to, just this morning I came up with this graph. And so this is more context thing for you private landowners. What I did here is just this morning, actually it was yesterday morning, I went online and I dug up all of the prescribed burns that have occurred in California very recently. So between April the 21st to May 17th. And I went online and I just pulled up the burns that have been registered in the what we refer to as PFIRS, the Prescribed Fire Incident Reporting System. And these are for larger burns where folks have to register their burns. They have to get permission to do a prescribed burn. And so it's a cool website that you can check out. It shows you around the whole state who is burning on any given day. And so I wanted to show you this data to answer this question: do private landowners actually burn in California? Because I've been in a lot of these workshops, and I get the feeling that there's this sense out there that just private landowners don't really have much of a role when it comes to doing burns. But when you look at the data, private landowners are significant. So this is just recently, this is the acres burned on the left-hand side of this graph here, the acres burned by different, what I call fire owners, right? So the agencies or the landowner type that was responsible for the fire. And so there were over 2,000 acres that were burned on private land just in this recent time period. As I've learned from some of my colleagues, it's not just about acres burned, right? And it could be more about the actual burn itself. Because even if a burn is small, it's significant because it's experience that you get, and it means kind of a step towards doing more and more fire. So I actually like to look at this right-hand graph here, the number of burns. And so we see CAL FIRE did some burns here in this time period. They tended to be small, which kind of, when you look at the two graphs together, the reason the bar on the right is large and the bar on the left is small is because these burns, the average burn was pretty small that CAL FIRE did. And private landowners did almost as many burns as CAL FIRE did during this time period. And the text there, the numbers on the graph, are the percent of those burns that were broadcast burns as opposed to pile burns. And so 64% of those burns were on private lands were broadcast burns. 17% of the CAL FIRE burns were broadcast burns. The rest were pile burns. So what I'm saying here is that private landowners are legit, and we do lots of burning, and there's huge potential for us to collectively across the state to do more burning. It's not, it's not just the kind of sense I'm trying to get across here is it's just not the agencies, the large agencies that own, fire. It's private landowners as well. Okay, so getting to what I'm supposed to talk about here for this talk, the prescribed burn plans. Do you need a prescribed burn plan? The answer is yes, you do. But what I really want to make sure people understand is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated plan. So what you probably have in your mind here when you first start using prescribed fire is you kind of have this devil on your shoulder saying, yes, you need a burn plan, and it needs to be super complex because that's kind of what you've seen that's out there are these, and the fire experts talk about these really complex burn plans, and that's what you need to have. I would argue that from a private landowner perspective, if your burn is small and in size and it's simple in complexity, then your burn plan can be small in size and simple in complexity as well. And so what I want to do here for this talk is talk about the range of prescribed burn plans that are out there and get you a sense of, you can choose the right type of burn plan that's right for your specific project. And it can be a very simple burn plan. It doesn't have to be a huge complex burn plan. Okay, I will be honest with you. I don't like talking about burn plans because it can sometimes open up a lot of uncertainties, a lot of questions that are hard to answer. And so this is why I dislike talking about burn plans. A burn plan is not defined in California regulations. Unlike other things, when we talk about like forest practices, they're often very specifically defined, but a burn plan is not defined. And so we don't have that kind of standard definition. The other thing is on private lands, they're not required, but they may be expected. And so what I'm talking about is like getting a permit to do a fire. There may be an expectation on the part of the person giving out the permit that you have a burn plan. And that varies a lot from person to person and from area to area, like the type of burn plan or whether you need a burn plan to be given a burn permit varies a lot. And so that makes it difficult to talk about at a broad level. If a burn plan is suggested, there's no standard format in California that we have to follow. There are lots of different formats out there. This is something that's being worked on at the state level, a standard format to follow, but my understanding is that currently we don't have a standard format. So it makes it challenging for landowners. And then the other thing is when working with CAL FIRE, if you're talking about a burn plan and what their expectation is with respect to a burn plan, often they have in their mind, that CAL FIRE person has in their mind an IAP, and that stands for Incident Action Plan. And that's what they use for a plan. And that's a complex document that really is designed for a big agency to organize and do a fire. It's not necessarily applicable to private land, but that's often the reference that the agency has. And so sometimes unfairly, that standard is placed on private landowners. And then in the end, you are placed as a private landowner trying to do fire, you're placed in the middle of a fundamental conflict of interest. And that is that the same agency that is designed to prevent fires is also expected to facilitate fires, right? So, and I'm talking about CAL FIRE for the most part. It could be the Forest Service. And this is this is just something that's just a fact of life in California and other states as well. But it is this situation on the private landowner perspective that we're kind of in the middle of this fundamental conflict of interest. Okay, why I do like talking about burn plans. Plans are good, right? And I'm a land manager. I've been in kind of land management for a while now, and plans are definitely good in general, right? I think we can probably all agree on that. Importantly, they can document due diligence. And so what I'm talking about here is that in the unlikely event of an escape that does cause damage, and if you're thinking about liability issues, a burn plan is a document that you can point to and say, look, I followed my burn plan. I had this outline of what I was going to do. I didn't deviate it from it. And it's a documented thing that you can have as proof that you had due diligence. And that can obviously go a long way if an escape that caused damage were to happen. And then in the end, they make a complex process easier. So I know a lot of people have been making sourdough bread when they've been sheltering in place. I've been brewing beer, so that's what I do. I brew beer when I have to hang out at my house. And it's a complex thing to brew beer. And when I have a plan, when I follow a recipe, I find that the outcome is much better, right? Because it makes sure I don't miss a step. And the outcome is usually better when I have that plan. Even though I can I can probably wing it today. I can probably remember most of the steps without having a documented plan. It's usually better if I have a documented plan that I can refer to. Okay, so the range in burn complexity covers orders of magnitude. So on the right side of the screen here, if you look at burn plan templates, one thing that you'll get is this NWCG, and this is a burn plan template that is used as a standard across the whole country, and it's what large agencies use. This is an example of the front page of a prescribed fire that I helped with. It was a cooperation between National Park Service and University of California, and it was complex. Like, this was a burn in July, and there were a lot of people involved, lots of resources, and so it was a complex prescribed fire plan. It was over 100 pages, and so that kind of represents the more complex plan format that's out there. And then skipping over to the left side of the screen is the opposite side of the spectrum. This is a one-page plan. It's a map, right? And this was an actual plan that I had a student develop. It's a one-page plan it's a map, and then the legend is actually not complete in this case, but it has on here the burn location. It has some information about where backpack pumps were put out, and some notes on the prescription. And so, but my point here is that it can be very simple. It can be just one page. It doesn't have to be 100 pages. And then in the middle here is what I think of as kind of the more middle of the road strategy, or middle of the road in terms of the complexity, the range of complexities that are out there. And this is a template that has been developed by UC Cooperative Extension. So that's what I am involved with. I will suggest to Mark and Fadzi that I can give you this template if you don't have it. You might already have it, but if not, I can give you this template as a document that you can share with participants, because I think of it as a kind of general burn plan template that it's not hugely complex, but it also includes the basic elements of most prescribed burn plans. And so that's what I'm going to go through, is the elements of the prescribed burn plan that are represented by this kind of middle of the road plan in terms of the complexity. Okay, actually, before I do that, though, I want to really quick, because I think a lot of small landowners out there will probably do that more or less complex plan that I'm talking about. And so this is an example of a one-page plan that was from, let's see, this was February 2018. It was a winter burn, so there was no permit required. These are just basic things. So what this plan was the map, and then some notes on it that had the prescription. And I'll go over the prescription parameters later. But this is an example of the prescription parameters that one might have: relative humidity, the range of relative humidity and temperature and wind speed, and then 10-hour fuel moisture that was acceptable. And I need to cover cover my butt here and say that I'm not saying that this is the right prescription for you. You need to develop your own prescription that will work for you. But this is an example of one that's worked for me in terms of winter burns, at this elevation of this particular burn. Okay. All right. So what are the elements? The most important elements of a burn plan. And again, this is kind of the middle of the road in terms of complexity. So I'm going to go through the different components here. Basic plan information. Typically, a prescribed burn plan will have who's in charge of the burn, what the burn is called, the author, who wrote the burn. The agency having jurisdiction is an important one for private landowners, which is the context of this workshop. It's usually CAL FIRE, not always, but it's usually CAL FIRE. If you have a high elevation parcel and Forest Service would be the agency that would respond to a wildfire on your land, then it could actually be the Forest Service. But for the most part, it is CAL FIRE. Or it could be if you're in a county where CAL FIRE contracts fire suppression to a county fire suppression agency, then it could also be the county that has jurisdiction. But that's an important one, to identify the agency that has jurisdiction. And then of course, who owns the property and the dates. Those are, standard plan stuff. Okay, project area description. This is just a description of where you're going to burn. It's important if you don't know it, if you're going to start burning, it's important to know some basic info on how to describe where your property is to other people over the phone or on a plan. So oftentimes when you call into the agency and tell them that you're going to burn, they will ask where the burn is, right? So they might ask the nearest cross street. You can give them the latitude and longitude. If you know the legal description, that is good. So that like the section, township, and range, you can give them that information, and that'll tell folks where you're burning. The size is pretty, a pretty standard thing that you'd want to know. How many acres you're burning, whether it's a quarter acre or 10 acres or 20 acres or 100 acres. And basic physiography like slope and aspects and fuels are the kind of things that you would want to know about. Okay, here is a map. That map just blown out. Maps, of course, are great when it comes to the actual operations, especially if it's a larger burn and you want to know where things are. Hopefully that map will outline where things are. And I don't know if you can glance at my talking head right now, but this is the map that I use on my own personal property, which is 10 acres. It's on my phone, right? So using paper maps is great, but when I'm doing small burns, I use Avenza, which is a great mapping resource that one can have on their phone. And those little squiggly lines on that map are just the little perimeters of the little fires that I've done over the past couple of years on my 10 acres. And that's just a good way for kind of tracking what I've done and where I am on the property. Okay, another key element that most plans have are the project goals and objectives, right? So what are you trying to accomplish? Is it just having fire for the sake of having fire because ecologically it's the right thing to do and you want to do the right thing for your property? Or are you more utilitarian in nature and are you trying to specifically reduce fire hazard or protect your home or trying to manage an exotic invasive species like the example here on the screen is showing? And this is key to have, as a metric of success, what your project goals and objectives are. All right, pre-burn considerations. This kind of outlines what you need to do in order to prepare for the burn. There's a huge range of preparation work that can be done. We've seen from studies and from plenty of observations that we don't necessarily have to prepare the vegetation across the area that we want to burn, because given the right conditions, we can burn in any kind of forest structure and a vegetation structure without manipulation ahead of time. But manipulation ahead of time can help us burn under a wide range of conditions. So there's that rationale. Whether you manipulate the vegetation ahead of time or not, one thing that we'll do is establish a perimeter, a fuel break around the perimeter, right? So you need to keep the fire in the box. And so this is your plan for how you're going to keep the fire contained, whether it's using roads or hand lines or dozer lines or whatever it is. Where water supplies, whether it's just backpack pumps or rigs that have pumps or garden hoses, whatever it is, that's your water supply. access to the location where you're going to burn is pretty standard. That would be on your map. And then a plan, a thing that might be in a burn plan anyway is a plan for protecting values at risk. So identifying on that map or identifying in the plan structures or cultural sites that need to be protected. Okay, the prescription, and like I said, a prescription needs to be developed. In my mind, the best way to do it is to develop it over time by using fire and kind of understanding the different ranges under which you can burn safely. There are simple modeling programs like Behave that you can use. Behave is a program that you can use to develop a prescription, but this is the basic weather conditions under which you can burn. In this case, I have temperature, humidity, and wind speed. Those are the big ones. Temperature, humidity, and wind speed are the big ones. If you add fuel moisture, that's good. 10-hour fuel moisture is really good. Probability of ignition is one thing there's an equation for calculating that, so it's harder to get to, but it is something that is convenient to have. Okay, smoke management plan. Smoke management plan can be a separate plan if it's a large project, and I think that you are covering this in another session, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it is a part of plans. It might just be referring to a smoke management plan that can be where a smoke management plan is just designed to cover the smoke aspect of burn. If the burn is small enough in scale that it doesn't need a smoke management plan. So in my county, for example, if I'm burning less than 10 acres, I don't need a smoke management plan. I might need a permit from air quality, but it doesn't have to be a smoke management plan if it's less than 10 acres. And this is something that varies from county to county and from region to region. But kind of understanding what the regulation is, and then your plan for complying with smoke management, it can be part of a prescribed burn plan. Okay, ignition and holding plan. This is how you're actually going to do the operations. So in this picture here, let's see, this is a slope in grasslands, and I didn't take this picture. I actually got this from Lenya Quinn Davidson, my colleague in Humboldt County, and this is kind of this shows what I could tell, like the ignition pattern started at the top of the ridge here, and then the smoke or the wind was blowing the smoke away up the hill. It's kind of this ideal situation in terms of ignitions. So it's just kind of how you're going to go about actually lighting the area on fire, right? And then also how you're going to make sure that you are going to hold the fire in place. And so this could be a written out document, the number of people that you're going to have igniting versus the number of people that you're going to have holding. A really general rule of thumb, people ask me all the time how many people you need to do a fire. A really general rule of thumb for a small landowner that's not dealing with a complex situation, to remember that, in my experience, about one person can light 1 acre per hour, right? And you often don't get more than like 4 hours per day of good time, of good weather. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how much you can burn with one person. And for every one person igniting, again, our general rule of thumb is to have 2 people on holding for every one person that's igniting, right? So if you're doing just a 1 acre burn, that's pretty simple in nature. Yeah, it might be feasible to burn with 3 people if they know what they're doing and they have some experience. Okay, post-burn activities. This is what's going to happen afterwards, right? So once you light the fire the fire lays down and chills out for the day, especially in forest land, the job is not done, right? Because anyone who's burned in forest land know that fire continues to smolder for quite a while, especially if there's heavy fuel that gets ignited. And so this is your patrol plan and your mop-up plan. Mop-up is the action of shortly after the fire going in and putting out fire or hot spots. This is often done around a perimeter of a burn area. Sometimes it could be a mopping up the entire area and putting out hot spots, but more often I'd say it's a mop up around a perimeter. And then the patrol plan is how often you are going to keep an eye on the fire. And this is important. I still think that most escapes that have occurred long on forest land anyway. most of the escapes that have occurred after that day of ignitions. They tend to occur later, later in time. And so that patrolling to me is actually super important. That patrolling plan. Forest versus grasslands. I know there's a wide diversity of folks here on this call. I'd say, like, in my mind, the difference between forest grassland is the number of people you have on patrol versus active ignition. So grasslands, you might require more people to be there during ignitions, but less I guess intensity on the patrolling side of things. Where it's the opposite with forest land. You might get by with fewer people during ignitions, but you need commitment from people to make sure they're on a patrolling schedule afterwards. Fire effects monitoring, these are optional. Photo monitoring, I think photo monitoring is super important, just to kind of to be able to look back at what you did, what you accomplished. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of my talk here, but having some type of metric that you can look at, whether it's quantifiable or just kind of photos, I think is super important. Okay, notifications. This I think is important. It doesn't have to be complicated again, but it's a list of phone numbers that you are going to use when you are starting the burn. So pre-burn notifications, maybe some neighbors, some key neighbors, if you have them nearby who want to know if you're going to do a burn, so just so they're aware of it. Air quality management district, if you need permission on a larger burn to do a burn, you'll likely need permission to do a burn on any given day. And then the local fire agency, and this stuff kind of at the local fire agency, that will be out if you're in a situation where you do have burn permit. These numbers will be provided on the burn permit, the numbers that you would need to call to notify. Day of burn notifications is often CAL FIRE dispatch. It could be other fire agencies. Like in my situation, I have an outlook, like a tower, an outlook station. I'm forgetting the name of it, but an outlook where they look for fires, right? So I'm sure that I notify that station whenever I'm doing a burn, so that they don't call in my burn as a wildfire. Law enforcement's, the agency is really the key agency, or the fire suppression agency is the key agency. Just the other day, I was doing a burn, and I did have a sheriff's deputy stop by and check out make sure it was going okay, and that was cool. Like I appreciated it. But just kind of know that you might get some law enforcement. If you're doing a burn, you might get some law enforcement just kind of checking in and making sure that that everything's going okay. Okay, other potential elements, especially as you get into more complicated plan, wildfire conversion plan. This is like what you're going to do if there is an escape and you can't handle it. It's the number that you're going to call, and again, this number might be on the burn permit. It's the contingency plan is like how you're going to respond to something that goes out of control or something that goes beyond your control. The go, no go checklist is a list of things that you come up with during your planning process that you need to make sure you've done before you light the fire. Sometimes I've had the agencies require that they tell me that I confirm that I've gone through the whole go, no go checklist. And this is another thing that in terms of documentation is a good thing to have, because it just documents that you physically checked that box. Yes, I've prepared the fire lines. Yes, I have the number of people in place. Yes, I'm complying with everything in the burn plan. And so that's a very common element of a burn plan, is that go, no go checklist. Okay, I'm getting towards the end here. And so inventory of resources, these are things that you're gonna have on site. I've mentioned backpack pumps in a couple of slides before. So it could be the number of backpack pumps that I have. It could be the number of people, the number of hand tools like Pulaski's and McLeod's, or it could be a sweet rig like this. This is an International Scout, which I'm really fond of, because my first vehicle was a 78 Scout that had a diesel engine. I would love to have a fire rig like this someday. That's an International Scout with a pumper in the back. I think that's my dream, to have something like that. So, okay, closing thoughts here. So a few things here. First of all, private landowners, I think there are the key. There is a movement occurring right now where private landowners are using fire more than they have. There's been a trend, and you can see it from the data. There's been a trend in private landowners using fire more. And as that first slide showed with the graph of the the number of acres and of burns that private landowners have been burning recently in California, like we're legit, and we're a big part of this movement. And if we just leave the burning to large agencies, and I really am proud of the work that agencies have done, but if we leave the burning to just those agencies, I fear that not enough work is going to get done. And so it is important that private landowners consider using fire if they're capable of it. And start small. Start small, build your way up. I think that's just so important to get experience, is to start small. Don't expect large things. Don't expect burning your entire property at once at the beginning. Just take it slow and take it small at first. And then keep an on-fire control to visualize your impact. I really think this is cool, because if you can set aside an area that you're not going to burn and just kind of commit to not burning it. It can be small. It could be 1/10 of an acre. It could be 1/4 of an acre. And keep fire out of there, and commit to keeping fire out of there, because you'll have this nice visual of of what the area that you've burned would look like if you hadn't burned it. And at the end of the day, what I really like and what's really fulfilling to me on my own property is to have a beer at the end of the day and look at the area that I've burned and see the impact that I've made. That's really to me what it's all about. And then some last words of inspiration, not from me, but from the immortal words of Harold Biswell, who's a kind of this foundational figure in terms of fire in California. And this kind of phrase is something I've always tried to remember. Fire in the Sierra Nevada is as important as rain. And if we think of fire as an ecological process that really sustains forests, and it's as important as rain, then we start to view it differently. And so that's my closing thought there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Rob. What an amazing presentation, very informative, and just at least kind of just demystifying getting fire on the ground. I will make sure to include the burn plan template that Rob was talking about in our emails back to you as resources that you can use, and maybe also the go, no go checklist, if Rob can get us that as well. So I guess we are done with the presentations. We are going to move on to our Q&A session. And maybe before I go there, I just want to remind you to fill out our exit poll when you leave the meeting. We really appreciate your comments and input so that we can improve the sessions and future webinars or workshops that we do on prescribed fire. So to get started, let me just go to the questions and go down the line. The first question is, I think this one is for Steve, and any other panelist or Rob, please feel free to jump in and add any other information that you feel is pertinent to any questions that we're going to go through. Can you speak to the FRAP high fire severity zone and how county planners and insurance should use this? The FRAP refers to Fire and Resource Assessment Plan, for people that may not be aware of what that acronym means. So, Steve?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. I can speak from my perspective. The high hazard zone becomes important in that there are specific CEQA obligations for new development. For example, California Environmental Quality Act requirements in initial studies for addressing and mitigating development within the severity zones. Presently in Mariposa County, as part of our countywide fire plan update, the CCWPP update, we are looking at some additional more focused severity zone hazard assessment mapping as a part of that process. So there's a responsibility for us to take a look at the severity zone FRAP map information and determine how that plays out into the developments being proposed. It creates a little bit of a difficulty in some existing development situations because some of the regulatory trigger mechanisms aren't there to obligate folks to an exact certain requirements that they would have to meet as compared to new development where we have the opportunity to do that or responsibility. So Mariposa County, we have some requirements for new development that require specific entitlements, and we address some of those things under CEQA and other avenues. B, our plan update is elevating those and looking at some hazard assessments associated with those severity zones. And of course, that's an ongoing interactive situation in that, you know, mitigation equals potentially changing the environment for the types of risks associated with locations. So yeah, we definitely look towards the FRAT maps and that information being provided, and we hope to have more refined, finer scale detail out of the countywide plan update currently underway to help us with making decisions.
Okay. The next question is for Rob. There are so many, 3 people that asked the same questions. They're interested in knowing what your, the app that you were talking about having on your phone for mapping is called. I know it has been answered, but just for the sake of other people also to get that information, can you share?
Yes, it's called Avenza, A-V-E-N-Z-A. They have a free version that works fine for most applications. If you want to get a little bit more complicated, I think it's like $25 a year. If you want to actually save, you know, mapping elements and stuff like that. But it's cool. You can, and there's lots of free maps available online that you can get. So that's the one that I would recommend is Avenza.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Steve. In Tulare County, the general plan has designated the WUI as planned future residential areas. Can you speak about this problem? Steve, if you're speaking, you are muted. You're still muted.
Okay, there we go. In Tulare County, the general plan does what? I didn't hear that last part, I'm sorry.
In Tulare County, the general plan has designated the WUI as planned future residential growth areas. Can you speak about this problem?
Okay, if the general plan identifies that, I would say that the safety element probably establishes some requirements for that fire risk area. And so I would say take a look at that and also maybe your local hazard mitigation plan and see how they work together with the also the CAL FIRE plan for the area. I think that being the units have a strategic fire plan typically that they utilize on an annual basis. We have that here in Mariposa County in the Mariposa Madera unit, which is a very functional tool, and we appreciate that CAL FIRE there. And I would say look to those resources and determine what the scope of the potential development would be related to those, because there may already be mitigations in some of the other documents that would have to be invoked at the time of any kind of development in those areas. I think that if you want additional information on that, feel free to send me an email and I'll do what I can to help you with gathering up that additional information.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
The next question about a term that you used in your presentation, Steve, about legacy vegetation. Someone wants to know if that's related to native or historic vegetation, or is it necessarily related to that? Or what?
Yeah,
what
I think it's just an overarching term of art, kind of. It's not necessarily that technical. It's an easy way to reference reference some of the growth of vegetation that's occurred naturally in the fire adapted landscapes, where there's also been an element of suppression by humans, thereby resulting in additional growth. As we know, in a fire adapted landscape, we would have circumstances where fires would sweep through and we wouldn't suppress them. And so some of that vegetation that we're looking at around us that we're used to seeing as beautiful and all these other things are not representative of the ecosystem ecology without humans involved, because of the fact there's been some suppression. So when I reference legacy, that's kind of what I'm looking at. Circumstances where there's been suppression, and primarily for protection of human-built environments, and thereby resulting in additional vegetation that would not necessarily be otherwise.
Okay, great. The next question is about CEQA being required. Is CEQA required for private landowners? And then what about fire safe or fire-wise organizations?
Yeah, I can chime in on that. That's a good question that a lot of landowners often have. So CEQA is not required. That's kind of one of the reasons why I think private landowners have a good capacity to increase the use of fire, is because if you're doing the fire yourself and you're not using grant funds or public funds that require CEQA, you don't have to go through CEQA. You can get a permit to burn if it's the time of year that requires permits, or you can burn in the wintertime when you don't need a permit. None of like the act of burning to get a permit or to burn without a permit, they don't require CEQA unless it's part of a bigger program that you're getting funding for, in which case you would know, like that, when you're applying for the funding, you would know very clearly if that funding source was requiring CEQA or not.
Okay, so it's the same thing with fire safe or fire-wise organizations. They don't need CEQA as well, right?
Well, I don't know about that. That's kind of the part of if that organization is getting funding and that funding source is saying they need to go through CEQA, then it could trigger CEQA. It just depends on where they're getting their money.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And then, are you able to comment about the Board of Forestry efforts to relax the road access standards? I think that's for Steve.
I hope so, because I do not know the answer.
I don't have a lot of information about that. I would say locally, road standards for our area are going to be driven for new development based on the existing regulatory framework. Unless the state agency institutes law and regulations that require us to change the local regulations, then we would continue to apply what makes sense here locally. We have a subdivision ordinance, for example, road improvement and circulation policy, the minimum standards for roadways for those types of developments that I'm speaking of, new development, where we can apply this on these requirements. They would equal minimum fire safe requirements for roadways. That being said, a 20-foot wide gravel surface road for rural areas with cuts, fills, things of that sort to serve the development. And then the roadways are also triggered for new development by what the impacts of the project are. So in the case of the prescribed burning, like was just mentioned a moment ago, there's some things that aren't subject to CEQA. In the case of development, in the WUI, we're looking at those existing regulatory frameworks and applying those. And in the instance where someone wants to do something in, let's say, a severity zone, we're definitely going to be looking at the requirements for the minimums, at least for the fire, the road access. So I don't know what the Board of Forestry's circumstances are presently for promulgating any new regulations or pushing that from the state side. But I know locally we have the authority to apply the things that we need to exact out of a development process to make sure that it meets CEQA obligations for mitigating fire risk in severity zones. So maybe that's helpful to you.
I hope so. And then I think this question is for Rob. What is the threshold size above which broadcast burn must be registered through PFAS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a simple answer. So I kind of think about it. So each district is different with respect to the size of project, needing different levels of planning with respect to smoke management and different permit types. So I think of them as 3 different levels. At the very simplest level, which is residential dooryard burning, you know, the kind of when they say 4 by 4 foot piles, that whole thing. You don't need a permit for that. If you kick it up a notch and go to a larger pile size or a larger burn area, then the next kind of level is a permit that's required, a smoke emissions permit essentially from the local air district. And that's not a plan, it's more of a permit because the kind of context there is that it's not a huge plan, there's not gonna be huge emissions associated with it. And then if you get above the next threshold, then you do need a smoke management plan that's reviewed by the local air district. And so it varies. The problem is, or not the problem, but the challenge for landowners across the whole state is that it varies from district to district. In my district, which is in El Dorado County, or at least where I burned the most, it takes 10 acres to get to that final threshold where I need a smoke management plan. So below that, if it's a 5-acre burn, then I don't need a complex plan. It's more just a permit that I would need, and that's a very simple form that I would fill out. I will state, I want to say here that Air Resources Board has been great. Like during California's kind of collective effort to increase the use of fire, California Air Resources Board have been very kind of adaptive to facilitating fire, and the communication, for the most part, what I've heard, communication between landowners and the local air district, regulators, has been really good and really smooth, and so don't see smoke management as like a big deterrent towards doing fire, is my bottom line. So.
Thanks, Rob. The next question is for Steve. Would your site development standards include constructed wetlands or permaculturally oriented systems to increase like suitability of soils for agriculture and conserve water for irrigation?
That's a pretty packed question. So I can appreciate that. Can you repeat the first part of that, Fadzai, please?
So they want to know if, I think you proposed some site development standards. So do those site development standards also include constructed wetlands or similar permaculturally oriented systems?
We haven't looked at that in part of the regulations that we're looking at presently as a circumstance regarding permaculture and some of the techniques involved in component sector analysis and things of that sort. Certainly the planning for a project site is going to be only benefit from that type of analysis from my perspective. The circumstances for us are in terms of water supply, there are alternatives that can be looked at. We've had some discussions about some of the ponding systems and things of that sort, where during events they're utilized by firefighters locally. As a point of information, where I live, there's some ponding systems that were developed over time, and those are used for dipping in the event of a particular fire. As far as a constructive wetland and creating an environment that could be a reduction of, or minimize some of the fire-related vegetation, that's something that could be looked at. But presently, we don't have that in our schema.
Perfect, thank you. And what is the funding source for CPAW grants? Who and what entities are eligible?
So CPAW, we applied to CPAW. The mechanism for us and that grant was a in-kind from the CPAW side. It wasn't monetary for us. We didn't receive funds, we received services. And so that funding source came from the USDA Forest Service, and Wildfire Planning International spearheads the CPAW effort, and they gain their funding from the USDA National Forest Service. So that's what funded the work on their side. We had some work locally, obviously, that participating had some level of in-kind, but it wasn't a part of the grant. It was a service-oriented grant. If you shoot me off an email, I'll be happy to give you the links and whatnot for you to look at the criteria for application.
The next question is there an online access to no access road clearances and perimeter fence property line clearance? That should be for you, Steve.
Is there an online access for clearances?
Yeah.
Well, there are online available resources on multiple websites providing graphics for what the clearance requirements are in order to meet California Public Resources Code requirements. Definitely CAL FIRE has a very informative website in California for that. There's also some other resources that provide graphic displays of structure ignition zone, 30-foot clearance, 100-foot clearance requirements for vegetation management. In terms of landscaping and things of that sort, there's some recommendations involved with that as well, available online. In the county side, we do have some requirements as well, and we are actually building some webpage resources. Additionally, there's the Mariposa County Resource Conservation District has a YouTube website that has very good information, easy access for most people to just watch a video and check out how things are done. And there's a variety of topics, including vegetation management and clearances. So hopefully that helps you. And again, if you'd like specific links, I can send those to you. Just shoot me off an email. It's no problem.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in the chat box that Rob responded to. Rob, do you want to respond to that? I can't find it for me to answer to read it for people to hear what it was.
Sure. Yeah, it was Bud asking a question. Let's see if I can find it. The question was, okay, theoretically, on a 1-acre plot of forest land, how do the impacts differ between 10 prescribed burns at 10-year intervals versus one 100-year wildfire? That really gets at the essence of the fundamental benefit of using prescribed fire, in my mind. So, and the differences are huge. The differences are night and day. After 100 years of fire suppression, the fuel buildup in the forest structure, I'm talking about forest here, is such that when a wildfire does occur, if it occurs under dry and hot conditions, then it's much more likely to be a high severity fire that kills all the trees. And then the potential for conversion away from forest land is therefore high. And so, yeah, it's really the fire behavior difference can be expected to be very different if the fire occurs during severe fire conditions, during severe fire weather. Theoretically, fires that occur every 10 years, we have control over those, and we do prescribe fires to burn under conditions that are going to lead to low severity fires. And so the fire behavior will be very likely low in severity. And then when that wildfire does inevitably occur, it will also very likely be a low severity fire if you had burned a 1-acre plot every 10 years with a low severity prescribed fire. So yeah, that to me is like the essence of really why prescribed fire is important.
Okay, thanks. And the last question is, in Lake County, it's just talking about the different requirements in different counties. In Lake County, we have to get a permit even during the burn season, and you are not allowed to burn on less than 1 acre, nor can you move the wood to a larger parcel for burning. Is it kosher that different counties have different requirements for burn permits?
That's a good question. You know, it is. This is my opinion here. It is certainly reasonable for there to be different, you know, different contexts around burning throughout the state, because California has different ecosystems, and so like permitting and fire management needs to be different to match these different ecosystems. But there is, I would also say, a lack of, even considering that, there is a lack of consistency from location to location, from unit to unit, from county to county. They're working on that to improve it. It's something that private landowners have to deal with right now. My advice, I guess, in the end is to, well, I have a paper on this coming out in California Agriculture this month on permitting in general. So read that paper if I can buzz market my own work. And then the other thing would be to develop a relationship with the local person that's giving the permit. And it's not always easy to do, and they're not always on the same page with facilitating fire. But sometimes that's kind of what's needed, is kind of, you know, work directly with that person, or understand the structure, also understand the leadership structure when it comes to permitting, and who reports to who, and, you know, when you have to go over someone's head or stuff like that. And unfortunately, it's kind of that level sometimes anyway. In some locations, it's at that level of kind of interaction with agencies.
Okay, great, thanks. That was our last question, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank Rob and Steve for such an amazing session. Great discussion, great information shared. Please feel free, if you have any more questions for them, to reach out to us, and we'll be sending out the link to the YouTube video that we're going to record from this session. I think that's it for today.
Thank you, Fadzi, and thank you to all the organizers. This is a really well run, you know, program. So thank you.
Thank you.